Welcome here in the museum. I will present our director, Mrs. Bakwati, who will give you some welcome remarks, and then we will continue with the program as printed here in this leaflet. Well, thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon here in the Museum Rietberg. Thank you.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, dear speakers, and dear colleagues. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here in the lecture hall of the Museum Rietberg, one of two venues of the two-day symposium on geometry and color. I'm especially delighted that we have the chance to collaborate with the Kunsthaus Zürich and the Vitrocentre Roman, two distinguished partners. The aim of this workshop is to create a platform for scholars from Europe, India, and the US to present their latest scientific insights in the role the arts of Islam played for Western artists and architects between 1880 and the end of the Second World War. The subject has rightfully attracted the interest of historians of art and architecture in recent years, and has also been the topic of two major exhibitions in 2009 and 2011, curated by Remy La Bruce. As you can see from the program, the three sections of the next 1.5 days offer a very broad range of topics, from theoretical approaches to the analysis of early modernist paintings from Western to Eastern Europe and also India. Furthermore, these are investigations in new directions of scholarship, which certainly will enhance and deepen our understanding of this important period of transcultural encounters and artistic transfers. For us, the Museum Rietberg, the only museum dedicated to non-European art in Switzerland, the topic is especially and particularly relevant, as such encounters play an important role in our own research, in our own practice. It's very much at the heart of our own practice. So not only do we regularly stage exhibitions and develop exhibitions with a comparative focus, we have also explored at multiple occasions and will be exploring and continue to explore in the future entangled art histories of Asia, Africa, Near and Middle Eastern and European art. Recent examples include two very successful shows on the German expressionist Ernst Ludwig Kirchner and the Art of Cameroon in 2008, as well as the German Dada, or the Dada movement, and the role of Africa in 2016. In 2010, we presented precious Ceylonese ivories that had been highly valued and held in and been in great demand at the Habsburg court in Portugal in the 16th century. 3 years later, another project Delft looked at the cultural exchange between Safavid Persia and Europe in the 17th century. In this sense, this workshop is a very important and, from my side and our side, I think, very much appreciated continuation of our ongoing commitment to entwined, interconnected, and by extension, global art histories or a global art history. That's to be discussed. I would very much like to thank the organizers for their work and their flexibility and patience, especially in these very exceptional and challenging times. Sandra Gianfreda from the Kunsthaus Zürich, the Spiritus Rector, Francine Giese, the director of the Vitrocentre et Vitrumusée in Roman, Ariane Varela Braga from the Biblioteca Hertziana in Rome, and our own curator, Axel Langer. I'm very deeply grateful for this collaboration between three Swiss institutions, and I hope this collaboration can be intensified and continued in the future. I will now conclude and wish you a very successful symposium, full of inspiring moments and an animated and fruitful exchange of ideas. Enjoy and have a wonderful and very inspiring afternoon.
So, hello. My name is Sandra Gianfreda. I'm a curator at Kunsthaus Zürich and would like to welcome you on behalf of the organizing team. Let me shortly explain to you how this event has come about. I have known Francine Guisset for many years, as we both studied at the University of Bern. And when we met again here in Zurich 4 years ago, when Francine held a SNSF professorship at the Institute of Art History at the University of Zurich, we discussed the possibility of organizing a symposium together one day. I had recently curated a major exhibition dedicated to the reception of Japanese art in France in the 19th century, and while preparing this exhibition, I realized that something parallel existed for the arts of Islam. Of course, this subject started to intrigue me, and since Francine has been working in this field for many years, we decided to put on an international conference dedicated to this topic. Axel Langer, curator for Middle Eastern art at Museum Rietberg, was equally enthusiastic about this plan from the start, as well as Ariane Varela Braga, an expert on this field and since this summer postdoctoral fellow at the prestigious Biblioteca Hertziana in Rome. I am very happy that we joined forces to arrange this symposium, which promises to give all of us new insights. An exhibition to this subject is planned at Kunsthaus Zürich for 2023, and hopefully some of the topics which will be discussed today and tomorrow will reappear on this occasion in 3 years' time. As Annette Bhagwati has just pointed out, the conference Geometry and Color, Decoding the Arts of Islam in the West, 1880 to 1945, is a wonderful occasion for both our venues, Museum Rietberg and Kunsthaus Zürich, to appear jointly in public, to collaborate with other institutions such as the Vitraux Centre Roman, which has been under Francine's leadership for more than a year now, and to harness synergies. This event would not have been possible without the generous support of the Swiss National Science Foundation, the Swiss Asia Society, and the Rietberg Society. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, 5 speakers could not make it to Zurich, much to our regret. We will therefore listen to their video recorded paper and let them join us by phone here at Rietberg's and tomorrow via Zoom at Kunsthaus Zürich for the discussion. So please take the opportunity to ask them questions. Our event is multilingual, that is English, French, and German. We are aware of the fact that not everybody is fluent in all 3 languages, in which case we hope that you will concentrate more on the images, but please feel free to make your comments in the language you are most comfortable in. The symposium is being video recorded for archiving and online publication purposes, and at tomorrow's venue it will also be streamed live. It will be our very first time, so we hope you will excuse our beginners' mistakes. For your information, the camera here in this auditorium is placed at the rear. Please wear the face covers inside, and please respect the distance. I shall now give the floor to Francine. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, everybody. Also, on behalf of the Vitraux Centre Roman, I would like to welcome you to today's conference. I'm very pleased that we are able to meet here at the Rietberg Museum in person, or at least virtually, despite the current crisis. The scientific encounter that will take place over the next 2 days will continue the fruitful activity that Ariane Varela Braga and I were able to develop since 2014, first at the University of Zurich, and since 2019 at the Vitraux Centre Roman, the University of Geneva, and the Biblioteca Hertziana in Rome. Our goal was to strengthen research on Islamic art and architecture and its reception in the West through a series of international conferences and scientific colloquia, and to position Switzerland as a place of international discourse in these fields. In the absence of a chair of Islamic art history in Switzerland, it is all the more important to continue the discussions with specialists from all over the world and to give the discipline international visibility. Even though COVID-19 has shown us the limits of globalization, art history will not stop thinking globally. Therefore, it remains a necessity to consider not only the artistic production of the West, but also that of other civilizations, and to study their cultural interactions and artistic exchanges. The papers that will be given today and tomorrow by speakers coming from 3 continents shall raise the awareness for the outstanding role played by the arts of the Islamic world during the 19th and the first half of the 20th centuries. In 3 thematic sections, we will discuss the Islamic prototypes and theoretical approaches, the renewal of decorative arts in the West, and the relation of Islamic arts and early modernism. We will look closely at the sometimes complex and multi-layered transfer and hybridization processes and consider the historical context in which these artworks have been produced, and we will try to answer particular questions. How were the Islamic cultural sphere and its artistic heritage perceived by the West? Which were the prototypes chosen for transfer, and how were they received, translated, and recontextualized? Was Islamic art seen as an equivalent to Western art, or can we detect signs of superiority in the Western approach? These and many other questions will be raised and discussed during the coming 2 days, hopefully opening the path for deeper reflections on the still largely Eurocentric worldview prevailing in Western art history. Let me finish my short introductory note by thanking the co-organizers for the good collaboration. It was a pleasure to work with you, and I'm looking forward to new projects in the near future. I now wish us all a productive exchange and give the floor to Axel Langer, who will chair the first section. Thank you very much.
I will present you an absent speaker, Dr. Olga Busch. She's teaching as visiting associate professor of art history and visual culture at Bard College at the Institute of Fine Arts of the University of New York since 2017, and she received curatorial and research fellowships in the Department of Islamic Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and grants from the Spanish Ministry of Culture, the Barakat Foundation, and other national and international institutions. She was twice a guest scholar at the Kunsthistorisches Institut in Florence and has been awarded membership at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton in 2020. Her research interests are medieval Muslim material culture within the Mediterranean networks, European and American Orientalism, as well as cultural heritage and modern identities. Accordingly, she has published intensively. It might suffice here to mention that she has been studying the Alhambra since at least 2006, when a first article on this topic appeared in Artibus Asia, a journal that was at that time published by the Museum Rietberg. Her latest book is entitled Reframing the Alhambra, Architecture, Poetry, Textiles and Court Ceremonials, which came out in 2018, and she co-edited Gazing Otherwise, Modalities of Seeing in and Beyond the Lens of Islam, which came out of press in 2015, but was finalist for the 2019 College Art Association Charles Rufus Morey Book Award. We will now see a video presentation of her paper entitled Color and Geometry in the Alhambra and What Got Lost in the Alhambresque. As the current situation didn't allow Dr. Busch to fly in.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you and your loved ones are all safe and healthy. I want to thank the organizers of the symposium for working hard to move it forward and for inviting me to present my work. As has long been recognized, the pivot between the Alhambra and the Alhambresque with regard to architectural forms, and even more so color, was the work of Owen Jones in his architectural projects and publications. I will begin by looking back to the aesthetic principles exemplified in the Alhambra to better appreciate his achievement. Then I will examine the distance that opens in the 19th century between Jones's cogent understanding of the aesthetics of the Alhambra and the adaptations of the Alhambresque. The Arab room in the royal palace at Aranjuez presents a case study of the path from derivation to deviation in a design initiated by Rafael Contreras, restorer, decorator of the Alhambra, but overtaken by other forces. This case enables the examination of the interrelationship between color and geometry, which I take to be the crux of the use of color in medieval Islamic architecture, a principle that was mismanaged at Aranjuez. Although the Alhambra was built over the course of 3 centuries, the Nasrid palatial city is remarkably unified architecturally and aesthetically. The 19th century Orientalist imaginary singled out the Court of the Lions and its adjacent 2 precincts, the Hall of 2 Sisters and the Hall of the Abencerrajes, with their soaring Bucarnas walls, as the paradigm for Alhambresque courtyards and interiors. Jones was the main resource of those projects, both as a theorist and a practitioner. His text, plans, elevations, sections, and details of the Alhambra was first available in installments in 1835, and then as a 2-volume edition illustrated with Jones' pioneering chromolithographic plates between 1842 and 45. Jones put his studies of Nasrid architectural design and his articulation of its corresponding color theory to the test in his construction of the Alhambra Court at the Crystal Palace in London in 1851 and then at Sydenham in 1854, together with his publications supplemented or substituted for on-site study of the Alhambra for architects and the general public, newly interested in so-called Oriental art. Certainly, Jones's painstaking scientific approach to measurement and his skills as a draftsman, his invention of chromolithography, and his talent for commercial diffusion were all factors in his widespread influence. I begin discussion with Jones's careful study of the advanced geometry of the Nasrid builders. Plain crystallographic group theory was made possible only with the aid of X-rays in 1990s. And yet mathematicians who have undertaken the analysis of geometric design in the Alhambra have found that the Nasrids had discovered and employed all of the 17 possible 2-dimensional symmetry groups in their tile mosaics. I would also cite the use of a single geometric ratio, the square root of 2, that Nasrid builders used as the basis for all calculations in order to endow the splendid variety with an overall unity. Jones recognized that the overwhelming impression of decorative abundance in the Alhambra was the result of scientific principles, becoming the first European architect to accurately analyze the construction of muqarnas arches and vaults and to produce geometric drawings of individual muqarnas elements and of complete compositions. He published his findings in the plans elevations and in his understudied guidebook to the Alhambra Court, where he was also the first to reproduce muqarnas architecturally. Jones also understood that the key to Nasrid design was the interrelationship between geometry and color. In that lesser-known guidebook of 1854, he comments that the ornaments, quote, always fit the places they occupy. The pattern never is interrupted or broken by any other than a natural division, end of quote. Taking fit literally as a spatial term, the observation suggests geometric proportionality. But I want to propose that fitness here has a broader meaning in the aesthetics of the Alhambra, whose traditional term in the West is harmony, and whose spokesperson in medieval Islamic art is the 11th century experimental scientist Ibn al-Haytham. In his groundbreaking treatise, The Book of Optics, he underlined the role of light and color as the foundations of perception, and distinguished between the perception of all individual properties, such as shape, size, distance, and position, and paired properties like separation and continuity, smoothness and roughness, and motion and rest. Many of those properties, both individual and paired, are measurable quantities and so relate to proportionality. Of special pertinence to Jones's sense of fitness, however, Ibn al-Haytham also argued that aesthetic judgment depended as well upon the more elusive principle of harmony. Thus, he stated that, quote, the beauty's completion and perfection is due only to the proportionality and harmony that may obtain between the particular properties, end of quote. Jones is more vague, but no less apt in capturing the fundamental role of harmony in Nasrid aesthetics when he emphasizes that colors were chosen for the surfaces in the Alhambra with an eye to what would, quote, add most to the general effect, unquote. He is more concrete in relating proportionality to harmony and geometry to color when he remarks, quote, every transition of form is accompanied by a modification of color, so disposed as to assist in producing distinctness of expression and in more visibly bringing out the form, end of quote. Hence, he echoes Ibn al-Haytham's analysis of continuity and separation made perceptible by the use of color. Jones illustrates the point when he explains the distribution of primary color in the parietal decoration in the Alhambra. Quote, on molded surfaces, they placed red, the strongest color of the three, in the depths, where it might be softened by shadow, never on the surface. Blue in the shade, and gold on all surfaces exposed to light, for it is evident that by this arrangement alone could their true value be obtained, end of quote. Contemporary work in conservation corroborates that analysis of highly textured surfaces carved at varying depths was painted. As I have discussed previously, the Muqarnas walls of the Hall of Two Sisters and of the Hall of the Abencerrajes present astonishing examples of harmony. Illuminated by the windows and the drums, the visual impact of the vault's vibrant polychromy, the remains of it visible to this day, would have been heightened by the way in which the complex proportionality of the geometric design was qualified by the application of color to vary the perception of the visible properties enumerated by Ibn al-Haytham, the distance between the observer's eyes and the vault's receding depths, the highly textured surfaces of the Muqarnas elements, that is smoothness and roughness, and the continuity and discontinuity in the Muqarnas volumes and shapes. In accordance with Jones's propositions, it is demonstrable that a change in color in two identical geometric designs in the datas of ceramic tile mosaics in the Alhambra leads the eye to perceive them as two distinct compositions. There is no doubt that Jones had a direct impact on Rafael Contreras. Young Rafael was apprenticed to his father, José Contreras Osorio, who was in charge of work in the Alhambra at the time of Jones's on-site studies. So while Rafael Contreras' restoration of the Sala de las Camas in the baths of the Palace of Comares has proven greatly controversial with respect to its vibrant polychromy, careful examination shows that he was familiar with Jones's published work and followed Jones's chromolithographs and color theory closely. Contreras' numerous small-scale, brightly painted plaster models of partial elevations of Nasrid interiors, made in testing molds in his workshop, were exhibited and collected in Europe. His three-dimensional model of the Hall of Two Sisters, executed between 1842 and 46, brought him special success and notoriety. In 1847, he presented the model to Queen Isabel II of Spain, who purchased it for a display at the Prado, appointed him as restorer decorator of the Alhambra, and commissioned the Arab Room for the royal palace in Madrid. When the project was realized not in Madrid, but at the royal palace in Aranjuez, it became the first and only 19th century royal commission of an Alhambresque interior in Spain. Queen Isabel II was not simply importing the exotic from afar, as her European counterparts did. In the context of mid-19th century European nation building, This commission reflected the ongoing debate on the creation of a national architectural style that would signal Spain's distinctiveness and originality vis-à-vis its European neighbors. Rafael Contreras was a major figure in that history, both as the designer of Alhambresque interiors in the residences of Spanish nobility in Madrid, and in exporting neo-Moorish design, as it was often called, to the rest of Europe through the exhibition of his prize-winning plaster models. I pursue these matters elsewhere and in my ongoing research. Here I wish to return to the question of style in the Arab Room at Aranjuez, concentrating on aesthetic rather than political aspects. First, what went right? A plaster model of a complete elevation of the east wall of the Hall of Two Sisters made in Contreras' workshop reproduces accurately a quarter of the Muqarnas vault of that room along its elevation. This model has been dated between 1850 and 1855, but Contreras' mastery of the Muqarnas is attested by the Muqarnas vault in the Arab Room at Aranjuez, completed in 1851, the same year as Jones's Hall of the Abencerrajes in the Crystal Palace in London. Given the importance ascribed to Muqarnas in European Orientalism, these pioneering works bear emphasis. I note, for example, that although Ludwig Sanft was familiar with Jones's publications, he did not attempt to build a Muqarnas vault in the main hall of the Moorish villa at Wilhelma in Stuttgart, erected between 1842 and 46. I further recall that Karl von Dibich made several drawings of a segment of the Muqarnas vault of the Hall of Two Sisters on site in the late 1840s, but it was not until after Jones's and Contreras' successful constructions that he proposed his own way of reproducing them, and not until his Maurice Kiosk built for the Paris Universal Exhibition of 1867 that Dibich constructed a Muqarnas vault. The Arab Room in Aranjuez received much praise in Madrid periodicals when it opened in 1851. We can assess it with more discernment. In addition to his successful construction of Muqarnas, Contreras had demonstrated his understanding of proportion in his plaster models of the Hall of Two Sisters, executed with meticulous accuracy on a scale of 1 to 9, and moreover, painted in keeping with the vibrant colors of Jones's chromolithographs. But he was faced with an important constraint at Aranjuez. The Arab Room was to be built in an existing room within the palace, whose plan was significantly smaller than the Hall of Two Sisters, and its elevation even more so. Confronting a similar problem in his Hall of the Abencerrajes for the Crystal Palace in London, Jones explained that his reproduction of the room in the Alhambra was, quote, the full size of the original on plan, but diminished in height by omitting a band marked A on the diagram, end of quote. By reducing the height of the walls, he preserved the height of the transition zone, the cupola's drum, and the cupola itself, rendering a syntactically coherent elevation that follows closely its model in the proportional relation of its parts. Contreras' elevation drawings, if he made any, have not been preserved, but his plaster models of the Hall of Two Sisters show an elevation that bespeaks his profound knowledge. The extant Arab Room, however, is the result of other interventions, complicated by professional jealousy. The project was begun under the supervision of Narciso Pasquale Colomer, chief architect of the royal sites. Colomer not only questioned Contreras' qualifications, but also accused him of profiteering by planning for carved stucco panels instead of casts, as well as the use of mineral pigments and gold leaf for painting. The cost cutting led to the replacement of the dadas of ceramic tile mosaics in Contreras' plan with painted geometric designs. In 1851, supervision of the project passed from Colomer to Domingo Gómez de la Fuente, an architect who dismissed Contreras' accurately scaled models and casts as, quote-unquote, curiosity objects without any artistic married. It was likely under de la Fuente's direction that the upper elevation of the walls was eliminated and the transition zone, articulated by the large tri-lobed muqarnas squinches that braced the corners of the room, was placed directly above the painted dadas. The reduced elevation at Aranjuez required a cupola of shallow circular shape, altogether different from the tall conical form of its model in the Alhambra, yet still aiming for the visual impact of the soaring dome of the Hall of Two Sisters. The height of the drum was significantly expanded, with two bands decorated with medallions and the area between them filled with row upon row of muqarnas in the drum's upper register. This design allows for the articulation of a 16-sided polygon upon which rests the muqarnas-filled cupola. Even if the muqarnas cupola reflects Contreras' original design, other elements of the elevation, the reduced height of the walls, the transition zone of enormous muqarnas winches out of proportion to other architectural elements, reveal de la Fuente's incomprehension of the Nasrid compositional syntax. The resulting visual effect is one of utter disharmony, exacerbated by the use of poorer decorative materials and synthetic pigments. Then, literally adding insult to injury in 1851, when the finished Arab room was presented to the public, Gómez de la Fuente criticized it harshly, laying the blame on Contreras. Colomer and Gómez de la Fuente's mistreatment of their colleague is a footnote to architectural history, but their misunderstanding of Nasrid geometric proportionality and its relationship to color, grasped so well by Jones and Contreras, is an important, even paradigmatic instance of the skewing of the aesthetic principles of the Alhambra in the production of the Alhambresque. A remark by Jones concerning the scale of original motifs in their adaptation provides a key to the broader applicability of this analysis of the Arab room. He states that he modeled the mosaic dadas for his Alhambra court and its facade on the dadas in the court of the Myrtles, but, as he explains, quote, "We have been obliged to change the colors somewhat as the pattern given by them in the original was too large for our space," end of quote. In other words, in keeping with the aesthetics of the Alhambra, and for optical reasons that Ibn al-Haytham could have explained, color and geometry are perceived in interrelationship. Here too, however, the soundness of theory is belied by deviations in practice. The chromolithographs of details of architectural decoration made Jones's The Grammar of Ornament effectively into a pattern book for later designers. Despite Jones's indication of scale, which they missed, they also missed the relation of color to proportion and hence the fit in their original setting. In the expanded version of this presentation, for example, I look at the Salotto Turco in the Villa Mimbelli in Livorno and Dibic's Moorish baths at Albrechtsberg Castle in Dresden. In those cases, the large-scale decorative motifs may well follow models in the original setting of the Alhambra, but they're disproportionate to the Alhambresque interiors. In consequence, the colors appear too profuse, at times so indiscriminate as to result in flattened, monotonous surfaces. In a word, the disproportion in scale creates a disharmony in color. Or, to recall Ibn al-Haytham's insight, beauty might be inherent in a single visual property, but complete and perfect beauty is achieved in the combination of visual properties, not color alone, no geometry, but the relationship between them. Thank you very much.
I'm glad to introduce the next speaker, but she's sitting here, so this makes it a bit less complicated. Well, I'm very delighted to present a young colleague from our partner institution, the Vitro Centre Roman, where Dr. Sarah Keller works as a senior researcher since 2013. There she studies and analyzes Swiss stained glass of the Renaissance and Baroque periods, an important work in the context of the Corpus Vitriarum of the Canton of Bern. However, as a specialist for glazing, she also contributed to the research project Mudejarismo and Moorish Revival in Europe from 2014 to 2019. She pursues this scholarly direction with the Swiss National Fund project Luminosity of the East, Materiality, Provenance and Reception of Islamic colored glass windows in the West, already mentioned by Dr. Giese, where she holds the position of as a co-researcher. In 2013, she finished her dissertation thesis at the University of Bern, in which she studied the transfer of Islamic elements to Romanesque architecture in northern Spain. She's now going to present her paper, Illuminating Color, the Stained Glass Designs for the Maurice Kiosk and the Moroccan House. Thank you.
Harun al-Nura, nannte der König sich. Eine Erscheinung voll orientalischer Poesie. Harun al-Nura saß mit seinen Gästen im maurischen Kiosk, umzittert von buntflutendem Licht. Eine hehre Lichtgestalt, er selbst und seine Sinne labten sich am herrlichen Schauspiel. This is a description of the Bavarian king, Ludwig II, as he lingers in the Moorish kiosk in the park of his Linderhof palace. Already Olga Busch showed us a picture of this kiosk. The buntflutende Licht, the colorful flooding of light, in this small pavilion is created by over 30 stained glass windows, which are based on a star ornament typical of Ibero-Islamic architecture. The following presentation aims to present the design process and the implicated color discussion of these purely geometrical stained glass designs and to discuss their role between European tradition and Islamic arts. The Moorish kiosk was bought by Ludwig II in 1876 for the park of his newly built palace, the Linderhof. Originally, the pavilion was made by the German architect Karl von Diebitsch for the Parisian World's Fair of 1867. Von Diebitsch's hope to sell the building to the Egyptian viceroy Ismail Pasha was not fulfilled back then. After some years, in disassembled state on an attic, the railway businessman Bethel Henry Strasberg bought the pavilion and set it up on his property Spiro in Bohemia. Here you see the photo from the World's Fair from one of the journals who wrote about it. Ludwig II had visited the World's Fair of 1867, had seen the kiosk, which had created a sensation there in Paris. And subsequently, he had his architects design and built 2 neo-Moresque kiosks for the winter garden or pavilions for the winter garden of his residence in Munich. They were architecturally clearly oriented towards von Diebitsch's kiosk. In 1876, so 10 years later, eventually Ludwig II sent his architect Georg von Dornmann to the castle Spiro to inspect the kiosk, and still in the same year the Moorish kiosk could be bought and reassembled in the park of Linderhof. In his report from his visit to Castle Spiro, von Dornmann stated, er sagt, die dekorative Ausschmückung macht den Eindruck großer Echtheit, sowohl in Farbe als in den Bas-Relief-Ornamentierungen. Mit wenig Vergoldung und nur gebrochenen Farben ist eine angenehme und großartige Farbenharmonie erzielt. Wieder, again, a depiction from the World's Fair on the right side. Those mentioned original colors cannot be seen anymore today because for the reassembling of the kiosk the building was painted over. Still, von Dornmann's description of gebrochene Farben, broken colors, is surprising. the Maurice Kiosk had been particularly praised for his use of pure, unbroken colors when he was present on the World's Fair. It was described in the Deutsche Bauzeitung of 1867. Bei der Bemalung des Äußeren ist der Beweis versucht und geliefert, dass die grellsten und schreiendsten Farben ohne alle Vermittelung nebeneinander gesetzt werden können und sich dennoch zu harmonischer Wirkung vereinigen lassen. Ein Muster von Rot, Blau, Schwarz und Gold zum Beispiel erscheint dabei in einiger Entfernung wie das zarteste Violett. And in Karl von Diebich's obituary, the same author, Hubert Stier, states, die Bemalung, die Farbe, blieben ihm das erste und hauptsächlichste dekorative Wirkungsmittel. Er, von Diebitsch, verwendete sehr im Gegensatz zu der sonstigen Übung der Berliner Schule die Farben fast immer tief und ungebrochen, indem er darauf hinwies, dass bei der Bemalung eines klein gezeichneten Musters, wie die arabischen es sind, in verschiedenen scharf kontrastierenden Farbentönen die Gesamtwirkung dennoch in einer mehr oder weniger gebrochenen Farbe erscheint und die Einzeltöne ihre grelle Wirkung verlieren, ohne dass doch das Ganze monoton erscheint. However, it appears that von Dolman had a different perception of those colors when he describes them as broken. For the reassembling of the kiosk in the park of Linderhof Palace, the building was not only repainted but also considerably modified in its architecture. One of the two open entry halls was enlarged with an apsis and furnished with a, can I just put here the cursor, here's this niche with a throne. There is a muqarnas also introduced, and there are polylobed arches, which are also a later addition. I mean, there were arches before, but not polylobed. And the new floor was installed. But the most striking change was the integration of more than 30 new stained glass windows. 3 large windows adorned this newly created niche. Another 3 windows of the same kind were added to the side walls, which you see here, as well as for smaller windows, a lunette window, which you also see on the left side, were added, and the door wings are also made of stained glass. And the architect, Georg von Dollmann, designed these windows himself, and he based the decorative patterns on this star ornament from the Ibero-Islamic architecture, where it covers stucco panels, transenna, woodwork, and also the tile work, of which we have seen many before, the alicatados. Besides the designs for the executed windows, like this one here, you see also one image of the Alhambra, of one of the transenna, with the same star pattern, star ornament. And so this is one of the windows, yes. So here you see the designs for the executed windows, and besides them there are also preserved 6 further preliminary studies which document the design process for the stained glass. In comparison to the executed window, which you always see in the photo, these 3 designs show different patterns, which are based on interlaces instead of the star motif. There are also star motifs, but also interlaces. Then these 3 motifs, they have already the same star pattern, or almost the same, or a similar pattern as the executed windows, but the colors are different, and also the pattern has a slight variation. The applied colors are, with exception of one of the designs, always the same: red, yellow, blue, green, and violet. One design additionally includes rose. And meanwhile, this choice of colors apparently has been fairly clear. The positioning of the color was examined on the basis of various proposals. So here especially in the one to the right. It is shown how the architect was analyzing different color concepts. So you see how he exchanges the red, the blue, the yellow on different parts of the pattern. Probably von Dollmann presented these designs to his commissioner, King Ludwig II, and let him choose. The king usually was highly involved in his several building projects and concerned about many details, but there are no written comments on the window designs known so far. The colors used are all to be found in the Nasrid palaces of Alhambra, but not in this combination. Neither von Dollmann nor Ludwig II had visited the Alhambra. Later they had, however, first-hand illustrative material from the Nasrid palaces. In 1878, the cash book of the royal cabinet lists a payment for 140 photographs of the Alhambra. But more important for these window designs, dating already a year earlier, were Owen Jones and Jules Goury's publication, which we have seen before, plans, elevation sections and details of the Alhambra from 1842-45. One of von Dollmann's drawing matches one of the plates in the book of Jones and Goury. It is a depiction of a blank transcena, also a sort of window, a window grill made of stucco or stone of the Alhambra, and with a reconstructed coloring by Owen Jones. But here it's not an open work transcena, but it is a blank transcena, so really just on the wall, all made of stucco. Two other plates in Jones' publication show colored blank transcena. You see them on the left. One is not identical, but also similar to von Dollmann's studies with the interlacing patterns. And this building here on the left, its design belongs to the window of the newly built niche, where here visualized in a second illustration, a watercolor. And without, if you focus on the colors, there is no green on the middle illustration, and on the right side, the version as carried out. Owen Jones' blank transcena in the palaces of the Alhambra had no glass, but the English architect was inspired himself by this very same illustration for a stained glass design. You see again the plate with a blank transcena and a design by Owen Jones for a stained glass window. As far as known, the window was never executed, and it is surprising that as well Jones and von Dollmann chose this yellow coloring for the middle of the stars. On the contrary, the colors green and violet, so typical for von Dollmann's designs, are only to be found very rarely in Jones' plates and exclusively when depicting tile work. And also, here you see the tile work where violet and green appears. Likewise, the characteristic alternating colors blue and red for the rays of the stars, which here does not appear in the Alhambra. Exactly the same colors were chosen by von Dollmann and Ludwig II for the windows of the Moroccan house. In 1878, Ludwig II had sent the architect to the Parisian World's Fair to study the different orientalizing exhibition pavilions there. This led to the decision to buy the Moroccan pavilion, which would then be reassembled on the forest land Stockalpe near Linderhof, also very near to the Maurice Kiosk. Today they are both in the park. Voilà. This is the Moroccan house. When von Dollmann described the Moroccan house as seen in Paris, he stated that the window openings are covered with colorless glass. Die Fenster sind vom Fußboden hoch angebracht und mit weißem Glas geschlossen, letzteres wahrscheinlich, um genügend Licht zu erhalten. And he adds that there is a skylight over the inner court, and during the reassembling of the Moroccan pavilion, the king issued specific instructions for its improvement, so it was again a whole transformation of this original structure. So he wished, among other things, I cite, erstens, dass die grüne Farbe ganz entfernt und alles, was grün ist, leuchtend blau, das Rot feuriger und leuchtender gehalten und was gelb ist, vergoldet werden soll. Zweitens, bei allen Fenstern sollen die unteren vergitterten Scheiben farbig gemacht werden. Two loose sheets with Transenna illustrations are preserved in the documents of the court secretary. The 19 newly manufactured windows for the Moroccan house were exact copies of these illustrations. And its large skylight here is also based on the same patterns. Those two sheets are trace copies of plates from Émile Pristaven's publication L'Art arabe d'après les monuments du Caire. Oh, here. Here, sorry. Okay. This tripartite publication attracted a lot of attention at the World's Fair of Paris in 1878, and it depicted Transenna, here on the plates of Pristaven to the right, belonged to the mosques of Sultan Hassan and Al-Amir Kausun, in both dating to the 14th century, in Cairo both, and with the latter being mostly destroyed today. The copies, which leave out the frames, von Dollmann's copies are punctuated and traced with ink and pencil for auxiliary lines, so really see how he worked with these tracing copies. And here too, as with the blank and Transenna of the Alhambra, the models do not include glass but are open grills, open or blank. Whereas Jones and Coury's placed at least show colors, Pristaven illustrations are colorless. The colorful glazings both of the Maurice Kiosk and the Moroccan house were made at a time when, due to a reprisal of the Middle Ages, the art of stained glass in Europe was rediscovered. After it had gone out of fashion in the 18th century, it was Ludwig's second grandfather, the Bavarian King Ludwig I, who in 1827 had made the first commission for monumental church windows and had, with this, founded a very influential Königliche Glasmalereianstalt in Munich, and inspired with this the neo-Gothic enthusiasm. In the 1860s and 70s, where these stained glass windows were made, the movement flourished. The new foundations of stained glass workshops in Germany, especially in Munich, were almost uncountable. Also, the stained glass windows of the Maurice Kiosk and the Moroccan house were made in a workshop in Munich, the one of the glass painter Franz Jäger. He and his predecessor Heinrich Burmester had usually received commissions for neo-Gothic windows, as shown here. So you see there is no stained glass window known which is signed by Franz Jäger, but apart from the Maurice Kiosk, but there is one of the Königliche Glasmalereianstalt in the Cologne Cathedral and one by Heinrich Burmester. For the Kiosk and the Moroccan house, however, Jäger produced purely geometrical stained glass windows where the unpainted color glass pieces play the decisive role. The artist chose a technique for these glazings which was unusual for its time and could be reconstructed during the restoration of the windows in 2011-15. Instead of setting the glass pieces into slim lead canes, Jäger used a sort of sandwich technique whereby the colored glass pieces were clamped between two gilded sheets, which you see very well on the top to the right, where it is dismantled. And these gilded sheets already are cut into the desired patterns and then fixed with small screws. In contrast to the LED technique, the resulting window grills were wider and their outlines even more pronounced due to the gilding. Their overall appearance therefore resembled more of traditional transenna, as the ones depicted in Owen Jones and Jules Goury's publication. The coloring of the windows was, as the different studies show, discussed on the basis of several proposals and carefully chosen to reach the großartige Farbharmonie of the Kiosk as praised by von Dollmann in his report. The court architect seems to fulfill thereby the statement of Wilhelm Lübke, professor at the Polytechnicum Stuttgart at that time, and later in Zurich also. In 1866, Lübke described in his publication Über die alten Glasgemälde der Schweiz a general principle of color which should apply to medieval stained glass as well as for Islamic art and architecture. Das Farbenprinzip der Glasmalerei erhält in dieser Epoche des gotischen Stils seine reichste und reifste Durchbildung. Es beruht nicht auf dem Gesetze der Symmetrie, sondern auf dem des rhythmischen Wechsels, der Farbenverschiebung. Durch diesen rhythmischen Wechsel gewinnt die Kunst einen Reichtum des Eindrucks, der nicht auf verschwenderischen Mitteln, sondern auf der weisen Benutzung weniger Farbentöne beruht. Es ist dasselbe Gesetz, welches in den Teppichen des Orients und den Arabesken der Alhambra so glänzende Wirkungen hervorbringt. Exactly this Farbenverschiebung, shifting of colors, rhythmischer Wechsel, rhythmic alternation, can be observed in the windows of the kiosk. In this way, the architect Georg von Dollmann, the glass painter Franz Jäger, and King Ludwig II created together neo-Moresque windows in which the sophisticated geometrical patterns of the Alhambra are led to shine with striking colors. Thank you.
If I understood you correctly, you imply that there's a connection between Alhambra and the Far East or some Oriental country.
Because of Bristaven.
So what's the connection between Alhambra and the
No, there is no direct connection, or it's not something that I wanted to show. It's more like it shows how these architects of the time, of the 1870s, as Georg von Dollmann, they just had their books, and it wasn't even that important for them if it was from Cairo or if it was from the Alhambra. They just saw these patterns and I liked it and they mix it a bit, and it's true that those star patterns show in Bristaven's book and in the Alhambra from Owen Jones, they have also like the same roots. These are similar patterns. But there is no, I wouldn't talk about the connection between the actually mosques and the Alhambra. There is.
No, it's very convincing. A further question is, was Alhambra called Alhambra when it was built, or it was called like that later on?
I think it was called like this, but there are other which can
Because just to give you an example,
answer much better to this question. Francine,
like
maybe, I
Byzance
don't
was
know.
called Byzance in the 16th century.
Well, I don't know. Does anyone want
After
to?
it collapsed. So,
I think Alhambra is an old name. No? Yes.
It's just the meaning is still discussed, because there are like theories that it's because the stone, the Sabika hill was red, which is not the case because the Alhambra originally was plastered and it was white. It's just now, today, it is red. And there is also this connection to the name of the founder of the dynasty, but Alhambra as a term is not new. It's the name of the place.
So, or a more direct question is the East, which produces Alhambra, to Alhambra, or was it meant a big church or mosque at that time? Because probably they got some help from Byzantine Empire to build some mosaics and some colorful whatever ornaments.
Well, actually, the Alhambra is not a church, or it's a palace city.
It's a palace.
It's a palace
whatever,
city,
yes.
and one of the first, let's say, or most important palace city was Samarra, for example, but there were other examples already in Umayyad times. You have Madinat al-Sahara in Cordoba, so in the Umayyad time, the whole city is called Alhambra, and within this city you have different palaces that have been changed, but like the whole place of these on top of the Sabika hill, it goes back to the Sirid time, but I don't want to go into details. It's like in this Haifa period. So yes, I don't know the question. You have on the one side you have like the whole structure of the Alhambra, and what we are discussing now is like ornamental detailed decoration, which mostly dates from the 14th century, 14th, 15th century, and it goes more about this. So on this like decorative skin we find in the palaces.
Okay, that answers my question. I thank you very much.
Can I ask you?
Yes.
Yes. The Moorish kiosk was already a commission by Ludwig II?
No.
For the World Fair? No.
No.
It was made for the World Fair in Paris.
Yes, and it was the contribution of Prussia.
And then
yes.
it was bought by Ludwig II?
No, it was like a bit complicated history. He saw it then already and he wanted to buy, or maybe at least he did not buy it. Karl von Diebitsch, the original architect of the kiosk who made it for Prussia, he hoped to sell it to the Viceroy of Egypt because he had connections. But then the Viceroy did not want to buy it, and then it just ended up in an attic for some time. Yes, and then this Strausberg, this businessman, bought it, and also he had re-erected it on his property in Bohemia. Yes, even von Dollmann and Ludwig II, when they bought it from Strausberg in Bohemia, they had to give in exchange another pavilion. They had to talk him over.
That were made,
yes.
were they made after the purchase?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Because there were already stained glass windows also in Karl von Diebitsch's kiosk. They are documented in these images I showed you at the beginning.
And sorry, do you know why the alterations were made?
Yeah, probably there was the state of the whole building probably was not the best anymore, as it was dismantled and everything. But then it was very clear that Ludwig II, he had these proper ideas how it should be. So with this recoloring and everything. Also, for example, today the kiosk, did I show you a picture from the outside? Yes, it is all white, no? So this wasn't the case at the World's Fair. Karl von Diebitsch also painted the kiosk from the outside and very colorful, red, blue, gold, everything. And then it's only Ludwig II's idea that it should be all white and only in the inside the colors. So he had, yes. So, yes. And these stained glass windows from Karl von Diebitsch, they were lost. And so there it was clear there were just openings which had to be refilled. Yes, so it was a mix of new ideas and just due to the state of the pavilion.
Like, can there be drawn a link between the neo-Gothic or the Gothic revival and the theories about light and colors and the neo-Moorish window? Is there a link, or can there be drawn a link, or is it completely independent?
Yeah, no, it is very interesting how during this revival of stained glass there was one part, the idea was the Middle Ages and the Gothic, and on the same time there was the Islamic arts, and they saw like a close connection between it of exactly with the colors and everything, pure colors and simple forms, and there are really a lot of textual sources where medieval stained glass is compared to Oriental tapestry, rocks, carpets and rocks, yeah. So this is really something. Also, for example, Viollet-le-Duc makes this comparison really in known authors. It comes again and again, this idea of a relation between these two. And as you know, there is also this theory, the Saracen theory, that the whole Gothic architecture comes from the Islam, which is much discussed also in the beginning of the 19th century. Some say no, it is absolutely not like this, others say yes, it is like this. And also there comes this idea that this all a bit mingled up together. So it's true that it comes together, and also with that the light, yes, of course. Yes, it's just surprising, but for all these neo-Moorish architectures, the model is always the Alhambra. But in the Alhambra in the 19th century, there is no glass at all. So there had to be a real, let's say they had to find other sources, or this stained glass revival had to go together with the Islamic revival to create such neo-Moresque stained glass. But there is no model for such Islamic stained glass. It's nothing that exist in the 14th century or whatever in this form.
Is there not the mosque in Iran, in Shiraz, that has a lot of stained glass?
Yes, that's true. Yes, that's true. There is a strong tradition of stained glass windows in the Islamic world. That's clear. In Iran there are until today many, but also in the whole Ottoman Empire, it was really usual. All the mosques in Cairo, they did have or still have stained glass windows. The Hagia Sophia has one of the oldest stained glass windows which are known or had. The oldest one are lost. But it was something which in the 19th century wasn't in that way studied. The Alhambra was much more talked about and everything. And also these windows of Cairo, they are made out of stucco. They have quite other designs, and it wasn't, when you just look at the examples of the neo-Moresque stained glass windows, it's not what they copy. They make inventions with Ibero-Islamic patterns and put it with their European techniques to create something new. It's not that they see a window of Cairo and try to copy this one. Yeah. This the Moorish pavilion still exist? Yes. Yes, you can visit it. Yes, it's in this Linderhof Palace, so in Bavaria. Yes, it's just there is a glass wall, so you can't really enter it, but you can see it from the outside, from the inside, no problem. Yes, also the Moroccan house is really nearby. Yes.
Can you speak to the color palette used in the stained glass versus, for instance, you mentioned that there's some colors that exist in the stained glass that don't exist in the original ceramics. And so I'm wondering, is there any attempt to replicate the colors of the original, or do the artists for the stained glass just see this as a whole new medium that they can kind of create from scratch? The color palette?
So, I'm not sure if I understand it quite well. If they thought it was something new, or
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
What was readily available? Was this a new palette that they invented?
Mm-hmm.
And was there any attempt to replicate the original ceramic colors?
I mean, when you look at Voldonmann's designs, it seems quite clear about the colors he wants to use. And these are colors, I mean, there is always this predilection for the primary colors, so blue, yellow, often gold, and red. And then he comes, for example, with this green and violet, which is not really found a lot in Jones and Curry's publication. So there you see that he has his own ideas, and he tries and he examines different examples. So I think it's a mix. They have their models and see what they do, but then there is a certain freedom, and it is clear from what we know about Ludwig II with his castles and everything. He loved colors, and the more the better, and there had to be a lot of atmosphere and everything, and with this gold, a lot of gold everywhere. So I think it was a mix between these. There's the model, there is von Dollmann, the architect, which works quite systematically, I would say also, and then Ludwig II with his ideas, so this goes all together. Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you very much. Well, it's now a pleasure to announce Dr. Ariane Varela Braga, who is research fellow at the Bibliotheca Hertziana Max Planck Institute for Art History in Rome. Before, she was teaching at the University of Geneva from 2019 to spring 2020. And from 2040 to 2019, she was a postdoctoral research assistant at the University of Zurich for the same project as Dr. Keller and Françoise Guise, Mudejarismo and Moorish Revival. She obtained her PhD at the University of Neuchâtel with a dissertation on Owen Jones and the grammar of ornament. You see, we stay in the field, which was published in 2017, and she's currently working on her second book, or habilitation as we call it here, on Orientalist architecture, materiality and local practices in Italy. In this context, she wrote 2 articles on the Villa Monticello, which we have already seen, the former Swiss embassy in Rome. She's the author of 2 monographs. Among them is Une théorie universelle au milieu du XIXe siècle, La grammaire of ornament, Owen Jones. Quite impressively, she co-edited 9 volumes already, and already looks back to numerous articles on the history and theory of decorative arts and architecture, the revival of polychromy, and the reception of non-Western art. She's also the co-editor of the series Pensieri ad Arte, which is brought out by Editoriale Artemide in Rome. And her paper is entitled Through the Looking Glass of the East, Color, Geometry, and the Kaleidoscope. Please.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Axel. And so, maybe just put it this way. Yeah. So in the 19th century, the age of positivism and colonialism, scientific theories of color harmony proliferated. And many artists, architects, and designers looked back to the East for guidance. For after all, there was this idea that Oriental had a special instinct for color harmony. And as we have seen through Owen Jones, for instance, the Alhambra played a particular role as a model that could be taken for the general idea of Islamic color harmony. So I will again talk about Owen Jones. In this paper, I propose to follow the thread uniting the Alhambra and Moorish ornament, 19th century color theory and architecture, taking as a guide the kaleidoscope. I will examine in particular two ways in which the Alhambra and contemporary color theory intersected by looking at the works of, on the one hand, a professional architect, Owen Jones, working in Great Britain, and on the other hand, an amateur architect, Panciatichi, working in Italy. But first, what does the kaleidoscope have in common with the Alhambra? From the Greek kalos, meaning beauty, eidos, form, and scope, to see, the kaleidoscope was rediscovered around 1815 by Scottish writer and scientist David Brewster, who was at the time investigating the polarization of light by crystals and color theory as well. Patented in 1817, Brewster's kaleidoscope became immediately extremely popular, provoking an authentic kaleidoscope mania around Europe, as recalled by media archaeologist Erkki Utamo. Offering a new and stimulated visual experience, Jonathan Crary had argued that the kaleidoscope materialized a visual perception that echoed the frenetic life in modern cities, characterized by constant movement and urban renewal. Consisting in a tube that contained mirrors or other reflecting surfaces placed at a certain angle, the kaleidoscope could contain pieces of colored glasses, and that is the most frequent way we associate with kaleidoscope, or other elements as well, and which by rotating this tube created a multitude of symmetrical patterns in constant change. So, at the crossroad between art and science, the decorative effects produced by the kaleidoscope offered clear practical applications, especially for architectural and painted ornament, but also for carpet design, as Brewster explained in his 1819 treatise on the kaleidoscope, which you see here. And this practical or utilitarian role was further emphasized in the 1858 edition of the book, which was entitled The Kaleidoscope, Its History, Theory and Construction, with its application to the fine and useful arts. As Brewster remarked, you have his quotation, when we consider the immense variety of professions connected both with the fine and useful arts, and so on, the kaleidoscope will assume the character of the highest class of machinery, for it will create in a single hour what 1,000 artists could not invent in the course of a year. So the kaleidoscope produced symmetrical effects of contrast and series through the combination and variation of a few simple elements. It performed the basic principles of abstract ornamentation and was often associated to the ornament of the Alhambra. And this abstract ornamentation that would become the object of so much attention in the many grammars of ornament that appeared in the 19th century. And here I put a quotation from Half Fornum Analysis of Ornament of 1856, in which you see that he speaks of the grammar of ornament consisting of contrast, repetition, series, and he adds that perhaps the best illustration of the value of series is the kaleidoscope. The invention certainly attracted the attention of designers. In Paris in 1851, a certain Monsieur Rouget de Lille adapted the kaleidoscope for the design of tapestries. And in 1844, Scottish decorator and color theorist David Ramsay Ray referred to Brewster's invention in his book Original Geometrical Diaper Designs, of which you see here some illustrations, where he specially argued for the need to renew the ornament of the Alhambra, which, according to him, had been used in various manufactures for so long a period that they are now exhausted. Comparing the ornament of the Alhambra to the patterns produced by a kaleidoscope was not unfrequent in the 19th century. As already pointed out by Arnaud Maillet, and as may be seen, for instance, in this selection of quotes here, the multiplicity of colored patterns of Moorish ornament, its symmetrical variations, and the pleasure deriving from its contemplation could recall the glass grains of the kaleidoscope, les grains de verre d'un kaleidoscope, or the Alhambra itself could be described in the second quotation as a kaleidoscope of delight. On the other hand, for instance, John Ruskin, who considered, I quote, detestable the ornamentation of the Alhambra, end of quote, the mechanical device of the kaleidoscope was only a brainless way to produce ornaments. So you had both sides of it. Of course, Ruskin had never seen the actual Alhambra himself. His knowledge of the monument was based on Owen Jones and Jules Goury, plans, elevation, sections and details of the Alhambra, of which we have heard in the previous two papers, and in which Nasrid geometrical ornament was translated to the brightly colored and flattened patterns of chromolithograph plates. So as you may know, Owen Jones was a pioneer also in this technique of chromolithography. There is, however, no evidence of Jones using directly the kaleidoscope, but Brewster's invention certainly coincided with a period of growing interest on the part of artists and architects for geometrical designs, geometrical patterns, the study of Islamic ornamentation, and the popularity of the Moorish style. Already in 1815, so 2 years before the kaleidoscope was made public, James Canavan Murphy, Arabian Antiquities of Spain, which you see here, had appeared, on which you see several decorative patterns of the Alhambra that might recall the forms of the kaleidoscope. And it was soon followed by publications of Giraud de Pranget and then Goury and Jones in the mid-30s. At the time of its publication, Jones, which you see here on the left, was mainly known for his work as a color printer and as designer of mosaics. He collaborated with ceramic producer John Blasfit, publishing in 1842 this book here, Design for Mosaic and Tessellated Pavements. And if we look at the drawings he did at the time, several recall the crystalline compositions produced by the kaleidoscope. But as I mentioned, we don't know if he used it directly. Jones certainly shared Brewster's interest for the reconciliation of art and science, and he would combine his knowledge of the Alhambra with contemporary color theory to promote the revival of polychromy. While studying the decorative system of the Alhambra, Jones had found confirmation of the importance, as we have already heard, the importance of the use of the three primaries, so red, yellow, and blue, which, according to him, characterized the early periods of art. And he would later diffuse his ideas in the fine art courts of the Second Crystal Palace, which was rebuilt between 1852 and 54 at Sydenham, and which constituted a manifesto for the importance of polychromy throughout history. And this, of course, culminated in the Alhambra Court and its accompanying guidebook, where Jones detailed his theories on color and ornament. And this Alhambra Court was seen by millions of visitors, and it was a kind of reinvented and condensed version of the Alhambra, which not only contributed to the popular knowledge of the monument, but most importantly transformed the actual perception of the original Alhambra as a highly colored architecture, saturated with blue, red, and gold. The court's colored ornamentation attracted itself comparison with the kaleidoscope, either because of its pattern, as you see here from this quote from Adams, speaking of the endless variety of floral and geometrical shapes, or because of the multiplicity of colors that recall to Esquiros toutes les teintes du kaléidoscope. The kaleidoscope effect of the court was further enhanced in the section inspired by the Hall of the Abencerrages, where Jones used colored glasses to decorate a Mucone dome, probably inspired, as has noted Sarah Keller, by the stained glasses in the Mirador de Lindajara. However, Alhambra Jones, as he was called, was no revivalist. Instead, he advocated for the creation of a totally contemporary architecture and ornamented language that would be the expression of his age, and in which color would play a central role, as he had demonstrated to the world through his polychromatic decoration of the Crystal Palace at the London Great Exhibition in 1851, which you see here on the left. In this well-known decoration, Jones combined his ideas about the Alhambra's polychromy, painting the iron structure with the three primaries, but scientifically applying them in accordance to the theories of two contemporary chemists and color theorists, The first was the British George Field, which you see up, who was a producer of pigments, who had Turner and the Preraphaelite painters as among his clients. And he was also the author of several treatises on color harmony. And the second was the French Michel Eugène Chevreul, the director of the Manufacture des Gobelins, who had established in 1828 his laws of simultaneous contrast, by which he proved that colors were perceived differently if seen isolated or juxtaposed. So in the Crystal Palace, the primaries were applied in narrow stripes separated by white, so that the colors did not blend, following Chevreul's theory, and in the ratio of 3 parts yellow to 5 parts red and 8 parts blue, according to Field's experiment with the light spectrum. And with this system, Jones believed the 3 primaries would be blended in the eye of the viewer, thus producing what he called a neutralized bloom, and an artificial atmospheric perspective that at the time provoked general admiration. It was, for instance, compared to the paintings of Turner. Contrary to Chevreul, Jones was not aiming at a harmony of complementary colors, but at an ideal and symbolical unification of the 3 primaries into light, which owed much to Field's analogical system of musical harmony, as was shown by Michael Darby and David Van Zanten. And these theories, here you see his book, The Grammar of Ornament, his theories were diffused through this important publication that appeared in 1856. But let me turn briefly to the question of the primaries or the primitive colors. When Newton, and you see here the experiment on the left, had done his experiment with the prism, he had stated that the primitive colors were 7, like the musical notes. And this, however, had appeared to be in contradiction with the practical experience of artists who believed the primaries or the primitive colors to be 3, a fact that had also been established in the early 17th century by the engraver Jacob Christophe Leblond and his trichromic color engraving process, and you see an example on the right. Consequently, several theories would later try to reconcile Newton's theory with the idea of the 3 primaries. And one of them would be David Brewster, the inventor of the kaleidoscope, who developed the theory of the 3 spectral primaries. So he used light filters, arguing that light was made up of a mixture of red, blue, and yellow. David Ramsden Ray, or George Field, also shared his view. And Field even elaborated an apparatus, which you see here on the right, which he called the metrochrome, to prove that light was composed of 3 parts of yellow, 5 parts red, and 8 parts blue, a theory that would later prove completely arbitrary. But it shows an effort to unite art and science. And Jones' idea about the application of color, which he published in his Grammar of Ornament, were further put into practice in his other ferro-vitreous decorations. And I show you here 2 examples, like the 1858 shopping hall at the Crystal Palace Bazaar, which you see on the left, and the showroom for glass producers Follett and Osler, also from 1858. So in the first, on the left, Jones created a polychrome ceiling composed of yellow, red, and blue glasses that framed the transparent glass in the middle, while in the second, he not only decorated the ceilings with the 3 primaries, but also took advantage of the optical effects of mirrors placed along the walls to produce, as in a gigantic kaleidoscope, a spectacular depth effect that was described at the time as fairy-like. Uniting his knowledge of the Alhambra and contemporary color theory and applying them to new modern techniques, Jones demonstrated how art and science could combine to renew contemporary architecture. Light and color were also central to the Marquis Ferdinando Panciati Jiménez d'Aragona, who created a spectacular orientalizing interior in his Villa of San Mezzano in Reggello, Tuscany. That is yet another example, a very different one, of the fertile interaction between orientalizing decoration, optics, and color theory. Realized between the early 1840s and the late 1880s, Samezzano was a product of Panciatichi's imagination. He acted both as a patron and amateur architect, creating a hybrid style, a kind of horror vacui decoration, that is as much a blend of Western and Eastern styles and owns much to this Gothic or Moorish romantic spirit. Panciatichi never visited Spain, nor traveled outside Europe. His knowledge of Islamic architecture was provided by contemporary architecture publications. He had a huge library on the subject, and mediated through Paris and London. And two men were especially important for his conception of the house. The first was the French Jules Goury, a painter and ceramist who also produced Alhambresque vases in the mid-40s, and the author of a treatise on ceramics, you can see on the left, which was really an aesthetic treatise based on universal analogy that was recently noted by Remy La Bruce. And the other one was the Welsh architect Owen Jones, whose Alhambra court Panciatichi had seen in 1864, and that inspired some parts of the villa, like the one you see at the bottom on the right. Panciatichi also held the Granth ornament in great consideration, for he copied the cover of the book in one of the rooms of the villa. Like Ziegler and Jones, Panciatichi believed in the union of art and science. He was really a true amateur and not only liked to experiment with architecture, but with several other sciences, and this included optics. He participated in the microscopomania of the middle of the 19th century. But he not only made use of microscopes, he himself engaged in the creation of his own models. He was a friend of Giambattista Amici, who was a famous inventor of the achromatic microscope, and he was especially interested, like David Brewster, on the use of jewels as optical lenses. He was a regular client of the famous Parisian optician Charles Chevalier, with the help of whom he created several microscopes, some of which were exhibited at the National Exhibition in Florence in 1861. And I put the passage from the catalogue. So now to show you how this intersects in his decoration. So if we look, for instance, at one of the most psychedelic rooms of the villa, the so-called Peacock Room, which you see here, which actually was the Marquis' own dining room at the time, the multicolored Gothic fan vaulting appears as the most striking element. At a closer look, we can easily recognize the colors of the light spectrum, as theorized since Newton's experiment with the prism. And at an even closer look, we can remark that colors are separated by dark lines, more or less large. And I would suggest that this is according to the experiment of the spectrum made by Joseph von Fraunhofer, which was made in the early 19th century and was popularized, for instance, through the volumes of Ernest Brücke on color theory, a volume that was part of Panciatichi's library. Another example of this further dialogue between art and science that is present in Samezzano is the so-called Hall of Stars, in which colored glasses are contrasted to the whiteness of the walls and vaults. As Sarah Keller has shown, colored stained glasses were an essential feature of many Moorish buildings. However, here, Panciatichi makes a special use of colored glasses. The glasses have been inserted on the upper and lower sections of the walls, illuminated the room like so many colored transena, like an echo of Jones' metropolitan experiments with colored glass. And reference to Jones is not casual in this room, as it is this very same room where we find the stucco decoration of the pattern from the Granth ornament, which you may recognize on the right. But whereas Jones believed his neutralized bloom would be created by a precise proportion of red, yellow, and blue following Field's theory, Panciatichi does not follow this system. Instead, in his triad, yellow is replaced by green. So green and red might refer to the idea of the complementaries theorized by Chevreul, but it also reflects contemporary changes in color theory. and especially the young Helmholtz theory or theory of trichromatic color vision based on the works of Thomas Young and further developed by Hermann von Helmholtz, which shifted the attention from the triad red, yellow and blue, which was used by Field and Owen Jones, by assuming that the eye's retina consists of three different kinds of light receptors for red, green and blue. A theory that Panchātiki, passionate as he was about optics, would have known, if not through Brooks' volume or Helmholtz's treatise on physiological optics, which had been translated to French and of which a copy was also present in Panchātiki's library. So as a conclusion, as I hope to have shown through these examples, the dialogue between the Alhambra, color theory and optics was a fertile one in the 19th century, providing either more contemporary interpretations, like in the work of Jones, or more eclectic ones, as in the case of Samuzzano. In any case, this dialogue between Islamic art and color theory would continue to inspire many color theories also in the 20th century, as demonstrated by the Bauhaus or the work of Johannes Itten's spiritual and metaphysical interpretations. But that is another story. Thank you. So, are there any questions? Yes?
Who did this villa belong to? Or who was the patron?
The patron was a nobleman from Florence. He was called the Marquis Ferdinando Panchātiki Jiménez d'Aragona. And he was at the time a politician and an amateur scientist, and he had his main house property in Florence, and then this house outside Florence. But he started the construction, as I said, in the early 1840s, and then it took a long time to build it because he wanted to be present and to follow all the works. Yeah?
Thank you very much. It was really fascinating because it opens like a totally new approach to this topic. We have heard a lot about Orientalism. It's a bit always the same, so this is really something new. Are you looking at the case studies you are working on systematically now with this background, or is Samuzzano, for example, an exception, or are there more examples that you could bring in this context?
Yeah, well, actually this is a work in progress. So yes, this is what I'm trying to do with the research now, looking at examples in Italy, but of course with this thematic, examples also outside of Italy. So in the case of Panchātiki, we know that he was interested in optics, and I don't know, for example, with the example shown by Sarah Keller, it would be very interesting to see if it was also, there is something behind it, or, yeah. But yeah, this is the idea.
So one might conclude that there was a shift in this, or when you come from this three color scheme, that they shifted to green, red and blue, because I remember there was a shop here in Zurich which was built in early 20th century, and the colors they used are exactly the same for the window. There's no yellow anymore. And do you think that this was a kind of work?
Well, actually,
hypothesis, but
yeah.
could it be that this kind of atmospheric, I want to be a bit Moorish and Oriental, shifted towards something which was more scientifically based? And
I think that in the case of Panchātiki, this is the case, yes, but you have to bring other examples and find written proof, because otherwise it's speculation. But the fact is that there is a shift in color theory, and this is around the middle of the 19th century. So the idea of Field and the other ones about the three primaries, they see that it's not the scientific way we see color. So there is a shift. But the three primaries stay very important, because if we think for artists even in the 20th century, even the Bauhaus, the three primaries are always the same. It's not this one, no, it's yellow, blue and green. The power of tradition is stronger.
Well, I'm very happy, but at the same time I'm incredibly sad that I have to present Dr. Nadra Shahbaz Khan as the next speaker, but only virtually. She is now in Lahore, Pakistan, where she works as Associate Professor of Art History at the Lahore University of Management and Sciences. And of course she couldn't fly in because the circumstances didn't allow. She has held several research fellowships at SOAS in London, at the Institut National d'Histoire d'Art in Paris, at Princeton and Oxford University, and has been twice awarded the CAA Getty International Programme travel grants. Last but not at all least, she has been working with the Aga Khan Cultural Service Pakistan for the Lahore Fort project since 2016, and is currently working on the Sikh collection held in Lahore for a forthcoming publication, which I'm looking forward very much. She's a specialist in the history of art and architecture of the Punjab from the 16th to the early 20th century, covering up the Mughal, Sikh and colonial periods. Her studies, however, also include prehistoric cultures as well as Buddhist, Hindu, Jain and Sultanate art and architecture in India. She's the author of the monograph Maharaja Ranjit Singh's Samadhi in Lahore, a summary of Sikh architectural and decorative practices, that was published at the University of Bonn Studies in Asian Art and Culture series in 2018, and besides she has published several articles in renowned journals. As with the case with Olga Bush, you will see now her recording of a paper, and then we will try to call her in Lahore, Pakistan.
Hello everyone. Greetings from Lahore and best wishes for a great conference on this fantastic theme. I am grateful to the conference organizers for accepting my abstract and giving me this opportunity of sharing my ongoing research, and also for giving me the possibility of sending in a recording of my paper, as I could not make it in person. I would also like to take this opportunity of thanking Dr. Axel Langer for staying in touch over these past several months, and for very patiently updating me with every change in the program that I thought at some point that I would be able to attend in person, but that was not meant to be. I will now jump into my presentation because my 20 minutes otherwise will fly by quickly. So the title of my paper today is Traditional Geometrical Patterns, Their Methods of Construction, and Persian or Punjabi titles, The Unsung Legacy Lost During the Colonial Rule of the Punjab, that started in 1849 and ended in 1947. Another thing that I would like to say, this is an apology for some of the paper noise that you may hear. I've discarded a couple of recordings because I thought it was very disturbing. I'll try to keep it to a minimum, but in case you get some, please forgive me for it. Little known today are a series of catalogues and illustrated instruction manuals on architecture and craft, including woodwork, jewelry making, metal polishing, and fabric dyeing, published during the late 19th and early 20th century in colonized Punjab, which included both the Pakistani and the Indian Punjab. Thus they appeared in different cities such as Lahore, Amritsar, Jalandhar, Patiala, Rawalpindi, and several other cities, and carried instructions in all three important vernaculars that are Gurmukhi, Urdu, and Sanskrit, mixed with some English terminology and designs. These manuals, on the one hand, attempted to revive traditional knowledge systems, and on the other, communicated ideas of modernity to the Punjabis, who in 1849 were the last Indian group to submit to British rule, and had initially shown considerable resistance to foreign ideas. The text of these manuals carry a marked impression of colonial interventions that included craft documentation, categorization, and art and craft education. The use of the three vernaculars indicates the religious divide introduced and exploited by the British for political gains. It also sheds light on the missionary agenda of the state, where each religious entity was assigned a language and approached accordingly. The Sikhs through Gurmukhi, Muslims through Urdu, and Hindus through Sanskrit. Annexation of the Punjab resulted in severance of age-old traditional knowledge systems at all levels. The political change not only uprooted the upper echelons of society, it completely disbanded and disrupted hereditary art and craft practices. Major changes in the official language, which was changed from Persian to Urdu in 1856, introduction of new education systems, mechanical methods of production, and new consumers for traditional goods started to show signs of deterioration in local crafts within a few decades. The new political setup was escorted by an inflow of European aesthetics introduced to the local visual culture that brought a rapid decline to these practices. In his efforts to adapt to the tastes of the new patron, aesthetic sensibilities and techniques of the hereditary craftsmen underwent major modifications. The laborious miniature painting technique earlier used to capture court scenes and life of luxury was replaced with quick sketches and gouache cum watercolor method, mainly used for drawing or painting local occupations and sent back home as images of exotic India. Countless other crafts faced similar consequences, especially hand-woven fabric, clay and metal pottery, jewelry, and all fields related to the building profession. The awakening of the British rulers to the moribund situation of art and craft in India, and the fear and realization that it was dying out in the face of Western influences, came with the admiration of the Indian Pavilion by critics and general public at the Great Exhibition of the Industry of All Nations in 1851 in London. This is where, in Tapati Guha's words, and I quote, India was laid out as an exotic pre-industrial entity, against which the modern industrial nations defined their inadequacies and their advances, unquote. Among the sequence of steps the colonial government took to document and revive these dying traditions was setting up of art schools in Calcutta, Madras, Bombay, and lastly at Lahore, as well as the documenting efforts that resulted in publications such as the Journal of Indian Art and Industries. What this did to the local crafts was that all possible details of material and method were brought out in the public that were once strictly guarded. techniques kept secret by communities under oaths of discretion were published, and in George Birdwood's words, and I quote, "The spell of tradition was thus broken," unquote. Following their art and craft education scheme, the colonial government set up the Mayo School of Industrial Arts in Lahore in 1875, with John Lockwood Kipling as its first principal. To understand the term industrial art education, we must remember that art education in British India was listed under technical education and was administered by the Directorate of Public Instruction in tandem with the Department of Agriculture and Industries, which of course explains the objective of such institutions. General dissatisfaction with art schools, especially the first three at Calcutta, Madras and Bombay, had set in by this time, as European methods to correct the dying local crafts proved to be not only ineffective, but were also seen by some British officials as further distorting whatever was extant in terms of indigenous methods. Birdwood thus, in his handbook to the British Indian section for the Paris Universal Exhibition in 1878, acknowledging the ill effects of British interventions, noted that, and I quote, "Presently we shall see what the effect of the teaching of our schools of art has been on Indian pottery, the noblest in the world until we began to meddle with it," unquote. Writing in the same vein, J.L. Maffei, in his 1903 publication, A Monograph on Wood Carving in the United Provinces of Agra and Awadh, openly accepted the fact that, I quote, "Western ideas are the bane of Indian art," unquote. John Lockwood Kipling's efforts in light of these results were focused on preserving this fast-fading traditional knowledge. He tried his best to motivate the official and public circles to revive indigenous architecture, as to him, this was the first step towards re-establishing severed links with other traditional arts and crafts. Along with his responsibilities of running the school, Kipling also served as the curator of the Lahore Museum and was also in charge of sending Punjab crafts to industrial exhibitions at home and abroad. Kipling thus worked closely with the local craftsmen and tried to teach them new methods of construction, from patterns to buildings, without attempting to dismiss their existing knowledge. He was a great proponent of the local traditions and wanted craftsmen to build on their existing forms of understanding. Therefore, it is not surprising to find a reference of terms used by craftsmen for different geometric patterns in his article on wood carving published in the Journal of Indian Art in 1884. And this is an image from his article where he gives pinjara or geometric lattice work in wood designs, and next to it are the names of each pattern. Kipling mentions some local terms in his article with translations for some of them. And here are a few of the 13 that he lists. The number 4 diagram in the plate we just saw is titled Sar. And Kipling, of course, and I'm quoting him, thought that this was inexplicable to him. Number 5 is Kataridar, because it includes a triangular form resembling the Hindu dagger or katar. Number 10, Lolidar, Sashbar section, because the bars are molded and not flat on the face. Number 11, Gulandar Kunjarati, a hint of flowers proceeding from the corners. Number 13, Shash Tota, a pattern of 6 pieces. Kipling also mentioned that these titles did not seem scientific to him, especially if used for, and I quote, ordering panels of tracery, as they only indicate generally the kind of figure required, unquote. The basic aim, we must remember, of such English publications was to attract international buyers for Indian crafts, and these terms were not only difficult to understand, but were also almost impossible for them to articulate. Although Kipling admitted that his students belonging to the carpenter class had, and I quote, a rule of thumb knowledge of geometry, unquote, but due to insufficient understanding in practice, he thought that it failed where it began to be useful. Considered to be unserviceable, no attempt was made to record or revive traditional methods of learning and teaching geometry. Therefore, sons of hereditary craftsmen were instead taught E.S. Bourchette's Practical Geometry, published in 1876. By the time Kipling's successor Percy Brown, who served as the principal of the Mayo School from 1897 to 1909, produced his industrial art pattern book, other than the word pinjara, which actually means lattice work in wood, used for windows that would allow air and some light into the interior space but not unwanted gaze from the outside, we do not find any other term. This dismissal of indigenous labels for being unscientific is what has triggered my interest in them. What I would like to argue in this paper is that science or rationale behind the titles of geometric patterns had already been lost by the time Kipling and his contemporaries came into contact with them. Whatever was extant by then was not included in the official discourse, as they held no meanings for foreign buyers in the international markets and were abandoned for lack of interest and patronage by people in power. The fact that the native craftsmen kept using them in their publications is a testament to their cogency in professional circles. The publications I'm referring to are the craft manuals I mentioned at the beginning of this paper. These are, as we've discussed, were authored by native craftsmen or hereditary mistries who started sharing their secrets with the general public through these publications. Let me explain the term mystery before moving forward, as it will shed light on the context and authenticity of information given in these publications. To look it up, I consulted a 1939 publication by Maulvi Zafarur Rahman Abbasi Dehlvi, titled Farhang Istalahat-e Peshawara, हिंदुस्तान के मुख्तलिफ फ़नून और सनतों के इस्तिलाही अल्फाज और मुहावरात का जामे मजमुआ. And this title translates as a dictionary of professional terminologies, an anthology of technical vocabulary and axioms used in different Indian crafts and industries. Dehlvi explains that the term mystery comes from the word mistar, which is the tool used to smoothen the plastered surface, usually a long, flat, wooden plank, also the architectural measuring rod or yard, and mistri is the head of the construction team that includes laborers and craftsmen, unquote. The very first element that catches attention in these manuals are illustrations and their titles, as we have them on the screen. The woodcarver's manuals for both architecture and furniture laboriously enumerate a wide range of geometric patterns with titles like Mahi Pusht, which actually means fish scale, literally the back of the fish, but of course means the fish scale. And then Gira Katar Dar, or the Katari Dar Gira that we just saw in Kipling's illustration. Or this page on the right from Delavy's dictionary that has 15 different designs, each with a different name. Showing an interesting mix of titles leaning towards Persian, Punjabi, and Sanskrit. A different title for a different construction of a geometric pattern clearly indicates their relevance and effectiveness. Percy Brown's 1909 pattern book, on the other hand, shows several Pinjara patterns under one title, ignoring the fact that each type had a different name. For example, and this right, the section on the right is, is offered as close-ups for you to show you that, each of these patterns is different from each other. For example, what we have now on the screen are pages by an anonymous author, because the title of the manual has been lost, where each type of Pinjara design has a special name depending on the placement of the solid and perforated shapes and their angles. Therefore, what we have on the left page is titled as Khade Gazon Ki Mauj. The second one is Khade Gazon Ki Mauj Pakki Peedi. And then on the right page we have Vadvi Mauj Kachi Peedi. In the middle, Kunja Ratti Mauj, and the last one is Vadvi Mauj Pakki Peedi. So each one looks alike, but then technically they're different, and this difference is expressed through their different names. I would like to sum up by saying that with these forgotten titles, we have lost countless forms of knowledge and a wealth of information about people who were familiar with them. Having lost their names and identities, these patterns have been reduced to mere numbers. Unknown to us today, they're referred to as either a six-pointed star with hexagonal petals, or one corresponding to regular or semi-regular grid, or by the name of a place where it is found. I hope my paper inspires you to investigate this field, as it promises to yield a wealth of information, not only about geometrical patterns, but also about people who coined and used them. And last but not the least, the unsung mysteries who cared to publish them. Thank you so much.
So, welcome back. It is a real pleasure and honor to introduce Remy La Bruce as our keynote lecturer. Remy La Bruce teaches art history at the University Paris-Nanterre, and a large part of his research is focused on the imagined sources of the Western modern condition from the late 18th century on, and among them the notion of the Orient in connection with the reception of the arts of Islam and the debates on the reform of ornament. On this subject, he co-curated with Salima Helal the exhibition Islamophilie, and which was shown in Lyon. And before that, he curated another exhibition on the same topic, Pur Décor, the arts of Islam, which was shown in Paris. And he has recently published a book on the ornament, And today or this evening he will deconstruct Orientalism. So please welcome Remy La Bruce.
Well, thank you very much. And I hope my English will be tolerably understandable because because of my accent and because of the text itself, which I wrote, and as usual I have to apologize about an English text written by a Frenchman. But well, I'll try to. Well, if you really don't understand anything, just interrupt me, and I will show the images instead. Will be maybe better. Besides, there is another problem, which is that with the permission of Sandra, and the organizers, my talk will position itself at a certain distance of the exact topic of the symposium. Well, briefly speaking, my intention is to weave together the notion of critique, conceptually, I mean, and that of crisis, the relationship between critique and crisis, and to explore their interdependence in the Orientalist system of representation. I was too quick, in fact, yes. Which I will describe this system of representation as the quintessence of our modern relation to images. For this purpose, I will allude to the well-known debates on ornament in the 19th century, in which the critique of Orientalism and the critique of figurative images were closely associated. And I will eventually link it to Matisse's early work and thought as a case study. In fact, I do not mean to deconstruct Edward Said's definition of Orientalism, as this title could imply. This is not the case. His idea of Western system of misrepresentation, control, and violent exploitation of non-Western cultures from the late 18th century onwards, when the colonial expansion spread over most of the regions marked by the cultures of Islam. All this I would like to take for granted and to use it as a starting point to investigate its intellectual roots in the collective mind of our modern societies. My assumption is that in the context of what we could call a modern condition of mind, as Sandra just said, Orientalism appears as a self-deconstructing system. So if something is deconstructing Orientalism, this is Orientalism itself, more than any one of his critics. A self-deconstructing system, then, emblematic of a state of crisis, which also characterizes our contemporary relation to visual images in general. The Orient can be considered as the image world par excellence, aspiring to substitute itself, and this time this image is relevant, to substitute itself to reality. As we shall see, the inner contradictions of such a process of derealization endowed it with a critical dimension, which therefore affects the notion of representation, as much as the Western relation to cultures and people identified as Oriental. But self-deconstruction does not necessarily lead to a practical dismantling of the system in question. Although it seems paradoxical at first sight, I will also suggest that a self-critical structure, in the case of Orientalism, as well as in the case of image making in general, implies an intensification of the effects of the system, in a sort of headlong rush, where a higher level of concrete destructive actions immediately follows a deeper knowledge of their internal conflicts. Etymologically, Speaking of something critical has two meanings, the same in German or in French, related to the two substantives crisis and critique. The first one refers to a phase of disorder, threatening the perpetuation of a collective or individual state of stability and resulting in violence. The second one suggests a movement of inquisitive introspection, leading on to an analysis and a judgment on oneself, as the ancient Greek Cretan says. If something is at a critical stage, it means that it is both menacing and revealing. The way is then open to a process of analytical elucidation and to a burst of actual violence. In the case of Orientalism, as it was defined and explored by Said 40 years ago, a structural need for political expansion and economic growth created a cultural collapse of unprecedented speed and thoroughness in the colonized countries. You can just read for that the first quotation. Using the word fury, which is an unrelenting fury, which is quite revealing also. As we know, this process of destruction was legitimized by the ideology of progress, by the belief that the command of scientific and technical development befell to the Western nations and would lead the world to the best possible state, as Michel Chevalier said at the commenting on the first great exhibition of 1951. Together with the pride taken in techno-industrial accomplishment, however, what came also to the fore was the instability of any human system of representations and Europe's own relative, maybe even peripheral position in history. Evolutionism, the very means through which the Western nations affirmed their superiority over the rest of the world, threatened in return the firmness of their position in history and their sheer identity. The belief in progress was constantly counterbalanced by the crying inconsistency between the certitude of a better future and the anxiety of an insuperable relativity, that is, between eschatology and historicism. The results were, and still are nowadays, I think, a self-criticism tinged with a sense of melancholy, a fear of decadence and cultural disaster, lurking beneath the glowing aspects of techno-scientific progress. The very violence with which the process of colonization was expanding was as much a matter of anxiety as of satisfaction. And conversely, a preference for the primitive, as all the quotations here show, a preference for the primitive, as Ernst Gombrich coined it, manifested itself ever more insistently, and it encompassed the fascination for the Orient as a conservatory of supposedly authentic and changing sets of meaning. It could be tempting to separate these two trends and to identify a dual system of opposite forces, some working for the complete eradication of the so-called traditional cultures for the sake of progress, some, on the contrary, bemoaning and resisting this radical erasure by various means of promotion and protection of foreign people and things. But the thing is that the extreme degree of violence of the Orientalist enterprise of capture has been criticized from the inside by its own supporters without being alleviated for all that. Let's take just one example, among many others, that of the conservative art critic and French government official Léon de Laborde, in his report on the London Great Exhibition of 1851 again, who first decried, in the first paragraph, the miserable quality of European applied arts in comparison to that of the Orient, as he said, and then bluntly called for a final, but he hoped profitable killing of the latters. Briefly speaking, self-criticism was and still is an integral part of the Orientalist system of domination and destruction. It results in a melancholy which itself ends up in hubris, that is practically a rush to exacerbated destructive actions. A kind of desperate disenchantment nurtures a destructive impulse. Orientalist representations echo faithfully this complex dynamic of critique and crisis. The image world they create is almost systematically diagnosed by its own creators as the result of a process of derealization, substituting the imaginary to the real. Its own inconsistency is conjured up by the intentional exaggeration of its unreality. This fundamental disbelief that the Orientalist artist implicitly shares with his viewers is an essential component of the kitsch, with its mixture of cynicism and melancholy. Hence, the spectacular flowering of fancy paradises and fairy tales, deprived of any faith, but full of unbounded expressions of basic instincts, of violence or desire. These are twofold images. At a surface level, they set up a ravishing or terrifying sometimes Oriental spectacle, and more or less implicitly they uncover its fallaciousness as well as the meaninglessness of its real background. In one and the same movement, they show what they say they want to hide. This is particularly obvious in the Orientalist academic paintings all over the Western world in the late 19th century, when this kind of artistic production was systematically implemented and institutionalized. As a matter of fact, such a system of representation was bound to raise up the stakes in order to survive its own skepticism. It developed itself all the more passionately as it was disillusioned. Can we now apply the same type of interpretation to our modern relation to images in general? I already said, at the beginning of this talk, that the Orient constructed by the West in the modern age could be considered as the image world par excellence. In the Western visual tradition since the Renaissance, an image is a constructed unit of visual forms which provide its viewers with a discursive meaning. Mimesis was the name for such a vision, which was characterized by an intrinsic link between language and vision. Images speak. They abide by the antique principle of the ut pictura poesis, for the application of which the faithful imitation of reality, realism, is just one instrument among many others. This fundamental discursive quality of mimetic representation enables its products to establish themselves as substitutes for the real world and its lively interrelations. Beyond all their particular narratives, what these substitutes say is that the representation of things and living beings is richer and worthier than their direct presence. In the process of image making, the world is not reduced to an image, it is raised to the higher level of image worlds. Well, in the history of modern art, it is quite a commonplace to say that an increasing criticism has been addressed to the universal validity of this aesthetics of representation. A process of deconstruction followed, which challenged the academic rules governing the arts and appealed to the lessons of non-Western visual traditions, among them the arts of Islam, like here with Gustave Moreau. Whether all these Western visual traditions, where the relations between the imaginary and the real seemed to have been negotiated on different bases. while the Western culture of mimetic images was gradually collapsing, undermined by a lasting and powerful self-criticism which culminated in the shattering of the perspectival space in cubism, perhaps even more than in pure abstraction. It was expanding materially, starting with the first developments of photography up to the paroxysmal multiplication of images of all sorts in the ever-growing society of the spectacle. The more the mimetic imaginary is identified as fallacious, the more it proliferates in a race into wonder worlds where a self-diagnosed addiction has replaced the former belief in the ontological legitimacy of representation. Therefore, it would be obviously misleading to see these two trends, on the one hand the internal critique of the images, and on the other hand the accelerated engulfment into worlds of images, as simply opposed to each other, and to interpret the self-critical dimension of image-making in modern art as a univocal resistance to the violent proliferation of industrial images. In fact, the two phenomena are not only contemporary but interlinked. Criticism undermines the faith in images, sets off a sense of loss of reality, and consequently provokes the quantitative increase and technical efficiency of ever more devalued images. As I suggested, this is exactly what characterizes the Orientalist system of representation, which can be considered then as the most perfect embodiment of this global process of derealization, a sort of stem cell of this loss of reality, which lies at the roots of the modern Western mind. The critique of images and the critique of Orientalism are part of one and the same cultural system, which can be characterized as even if it's quite paradoxical, a self-sustaining state of crisis. A state and a crisis don't go very well with each other, but this is a kind of state of crisis paradoxically nurtured by criticism. Let's now go back to the field where this global criticism expressed itself the more acutely in the 19th century. That is the question of ornament. This was by no means just a superficial question of taste in decoration. Fundamentally, what was at stake was the capacity of a techno-scientific industrial civilization to produce its own symbolic order. When in the 19th century new rational processes of material production were continuously coming to light, a reconciliation of artistic creation and technical production became a central debate. The question of ornamentation stood at the core of these debates. At the crossroads of art and industry, ornament was expected to be the means whereby a rejuvenated synthesis between these two pillars of civilization would be created. But it first required to free ornamental creation from the domination of the fine arts and from the principle of the ut pictura poesis, this discursive dimension which was appropriated by painting and sculpture in particular. It was necessary to endow it, the ornament, with a higher, autonomous intellectual status. This was the task pursued by an active community of amateurs, art critics, ornament reformers and designers, which emerged in Europe in the 1830s and grew up until the end of the century. With this situation in view, they combined a critique of mimetic representation as an aesthetics of illusion and of Orientalism as the quintessence of this doctrine. Conversely, they promoted the higher artistic value of non-figurative patterns, referring with predilection to the formal principles of Islamic arts. The traditional notion of the image was thus called into question as the paradigm of visual creation was no longer a discursive iconicity, but a formal architecturality, following a shift from narration to structure. The Germans were saying at this time, were inventing at this time the notion of tectonic, which describes exactly this shift to the structure rather than to the text as the criterion to describe and to identify what a visual creation, I was about to say an ornament, but a visual creation fundamentally had to be. As architecture, rather than painting or sculpture, became a model for this new vision, ornament could no longer be seen as a sort of lower image or the byproduct of pre-existing images they were copying on vases, textiles, or any sort of ceramics. It could and should cast away not only any narrative propensity, but any iconic status whatsoever, without being relegated to the margins of human invention for all that. The final goal was to revolutionize not only our visual environment, but the way we all were dealing with it in the everyday life. In the viewer's eye, fantasy had to be replaced by rationality, and a passive contemplation by an active understanding of the surrounding visual structures, in order to solve the spiritual and material crisis undergone by contemporary societies. Geometry was directly responsible for this shared productivity of ornamentation, insofar as it implied the idea that the greatest simplicities could lead to the greatest complexities, and prompted the viewer's gaze to shape its own combinations of forms by itself. It is with this in mind that Owen Jones, again, friend Richard Redgrave, among other examples, provocatively challenged the universal validity of Western mimesis in an address to the students and teachers of the London Government School of Design in 1853. And you have it, imitation, when relied upon itself, is but of very low merit in the artist. In the same period, the young curator of the Museum of Applied Arts in Berlin, Julius Lessing, expressed a similar feeling by giving a positive value to the concept of lack of meaning, Bedeutungslosigkeit, when applied to, he said, Oriental floor decorations and carpets. If Islamic arts served as a model in this programmatic deconstruction of the principles of mimesis, it was because of their mathematical basis, as opposed to discursivity. Culturally and visually, what can be called an Oriental paradigm, which was in fact an Islamic one, led to consider these arts as the perfect embodiment of a Neoplatonic aesthetic, revealing a purely formal rationale beyond the confused muddle of visual appearances. Thus it was believed that the critique of the ontological inconsistency of Western mimetic images could be positively enriched by the celebration of a fundamental logic at work in Islamic non-iconic ornaments. There are innumerable examples of this early recognition of the mathematical geometrical side of Islamic arts endowed with higher artistic and philosophical meaning. Among them, the French connoisseur, writer and photographer Giraud de Pronget, who was already mentioned by Ariane a few minutes ago, who, as early as 1841, extolled a skillfully calculated art, un art habilement calculé, thus contradicting most of the Orientalist pronouncements regarding the unbridled fantasy of these ornamental grids. As a consequence, the celebration of Islamic arts was not inspired by the desire to emphasize their exoticism, as Viollet-le-Duc says in the quotation above, but rather by the feeling that in these cultures, combinations of forms went beyond particular ethnic and geographical identities and came as close as possible to a universal ideal order of things. Such a scientific anti-narrative approach of Islamic ornamentation implied a radical rejection of all the literary and theatrical elements of the Orientalist imagery. The picturesque perspective was thought at best insufficient and at worst prejudicial, insofar as it gave precedence to the narrative horizon of dreams and was not overly concerned with accuracy, which meant a possibly shared meaning of what was seen between the viewer and the creator of the image. However, now, this sort of Islamophilia cannot be radically separated from the Orientalist system of imagery in general. It should rather be considered as the culmination of its self-deconstructing dimension, as I was alluding to at the beginning of the talk, which contributed to perpetuate its destructive effects. Indeed, promoting the scientific formal lessons of Islamic arts led their defenders to exploit instrumentally Islamic patterns and transform them into modern systems of forms not necessarily recognizable as Oriental by essence, no matter if objects and ornamental details belonged to different periods and had diverse geographical origins. What was at stake were the purely formal transhistorical and transcultural principles they could convey to the modern European designers. The process of understanding the scientific applications of geometry and color in the arts of Islam ended up in an appropriation of the other for the sake of an allegedly universal, but in fact Western-centered reformation of our modern visual culture. The final result wasn't a distorted representation of the Orient, like in the Orientalist imagery, but a pure and simple obliteration. Practically, the notion of Islamic lessons, coming from an irretrievable medieval past, prompted the translation of innumerable artifacts extolled as material bearers of these lessons in Western museums and private collections of all sorts, thus actively collaborating to the overall colonial plunder and contributing to the accelerated collapse of local cultures under a system of imperial control. In doing so, a self-critical theory of visual creation based on a new Islam-influenced ornamental aesthetics did not counteract but rather intensified the colonial violence. A revolutionary relation to the present, typical of an avant-garde commitment to the foundation of a new cultural and social order, was strengthening the continuation of a state of crisis, as much as the disillusioned multiplication of empty images did in the context of Orientalist narratives. In both cases, a self-conscious internal critique of modern Western culture was conceptually deconstructing but concretely entrenching a thrust for global destruction. I would like now to transfer the same interpretation to the field of painting through the evocation of a case study, as I said, that of Matisse's early work of the beginning of the 20th century. This should enable us, as a conclusion, to verify first that the avant-garde artists and ornament reformers were sharing the same questions at the turn of the 20th century, even if they answered them very differently. Second, that the reference to Islamic arts greatly helped to dialectalize our Western notion of the image, and eventually that the self-critical position which stands at the roots of this modern culture applies to our relation to images in general. When then named decorative, the new gaze they were seeking to establish at the heart of the Western tradition of representation, the artistic avant-gardes of the turn of the 20th century were recognizing more or less consciously the impact of the revolution which the notions of ornament and decoration had undergone in the previous decades, with the lesson of Islam at their core. Matisse was certainly not the only one in the exploration and conceptualization of this decorative quality of avant-garde art on this ground. But he certainly went farther than anyone in this direction. I will not read again the quotation, the first quotation above, but well, this is quite, what is interesting in this is that it's quite late in 1945, so it means that it really it lasted for all his lifespan. I mean, the same ideas were just nurturing and inspiring him all along his life during almost half a century. Affirming for himself that this new decorative art he was trying to establish was anti-mimetic, architecturally structured, and musical by essence, he had no difficulty accepting that the same qualities granted to Islamic artifacts, carpets, ceramics, etc., by promoters of Islamic arts, these promoters that he met in Paris at the time, he had no difficulties to accept that these objects were recommended to his admiration and could confirm, this is the word he uses, or reinforce him in his own intuitive views when he discovered them in landmark exhibitions in Paris in 1903. We have two examples of the carpets he could see in 1903 in Paris in this not the first exhibition, but one of the most important exhibitions about the arts of Islam at that time in the Western countries, and even more so in 1910 in Munich, which is much better known, and to a lesser extent also on site in Algeria in 1906, in Andalusia in 1911, and finally in Morocco in 1912, 1913. But before being attracted, seriously, before being able to use seriously all these sources of inspiration, Matisse had first to get rid of the burden of Orientalism, since the contemporary relation to these cultures, for a painter at least, not necessarily for a designer, but certainly for an artist of the fine arts, had been integrated into a very powerful system of production of Orientalist fictions, very successful also, with societies organizing the production, specific exhibitions, and acquisitions by the state itself of the most remarkable, what were thought at the most remarkable examples of these fictions. So he had to escape this, and he knew he had to distinguish himself radically from all this system, in fact. A formative travel, this is his words, to the nearest Oriental country at that time, Algeria, offered him such an opportunity in May 1906. It preceded his more traditional Italian tour of 1907, and in fact it predetermined it. This Algerian fortnight, just 2 weeks, took place in a highly colonial context. Spectacular Oriental phantasmagorias had been displayed at the Parisian 1900 Universal Exhibition, for which Matisse had been working and which he had, of course, visited. In 1906, the same type of Oriental settings were shown at the Colonial Exhibition in Marseille. When Matisse was encouraged to travel to Algeria, he was encouraged by an art collector who conducted a wine business in Algiers, and the people he was talking with and were guiding him there were all members of the colonial troops. In such a context, it is a commonplace to say that Matisse's first personal Orientalist experience proved to be severely disappointing. But it should rather be said that this disillusion was intentionally pursued by the artist himself in order to deconstruct the Orientalist system of representation and to remove the obstacle it formed against a free inspiration taken from the art of Islam. This deconstruction had to be innerly experienced, not just intellectually formulated, as it may have been already in Paris when he was visiting these exhibitions, for instance, the exhibition of 1903. And this is exactly what happened when Matisse discovered himself almost completely unable to paint from nature in Algeria, except for one single small and not particularly exotic landscape. And when he told his friend Manguin he had been repelled, I quote, by the picturesque, the belly dancers, and the nauseous colonial eroticism. Conversely, back in France, the small southern village of Collioure prompted again, he says, his ferocious desire to paint. I might have underlined une envie de peindre à tout déchirer. What he painted, however, was the red carpets, a painting inspired by the lesson of the barbarian carpets he had brought back from Algeria, and therefore his first explicit act of allegiance to the decorativeness he had been discovering for a few years in this art of Islam. It expresses the artist's leanings not only towards the colors, but also the geometrical forms of Islamic design. With an almost aggressive lack of picturesqueness, it gives a concrete embodiment to the idea that the meaning of a visual composition does not rely on its narrative quality, but on its ability to transmit a stream of vital energy through the spectator's eye. Quite similarly, a year later, in the Tableau numéro 3, this is the title he gave to the painting in the catalogue of the Salon des Indépendants when he exhibited it for the first time, also known now as Souvenir de Biskra. In this painting, the Oriental setting is rendered almost illegible, abstract, wrote the art critic Louis Vaucel, although this Louis Vaucel was quite a supportive critic of Henri Matisse at that time, but he was really repelled by the painting, which is quite comprehensible, I think, was rendered almost illegible, and the woman body challenges all the expectations of an Orientalist eroticism. By so doing, the deconstruction of the Orientalist rhetorical cliché instantly opens the way to a deconstruction of the fundamental basis of a representational image globally. From then on, the shackles of literal exoticism had been broken. Matisse knew for certain that the academic representation of an imaginary Orient was alien to his nature, so much so that his very theatrical odalisque of the 1920s cannot but be seen as a regressive despondency in the context of the post-war so-called retour à l'ordre. By contrast with this transitory and rather questionable body of works, some of Matisse's most significant works of the 1910s are, consciously or not, attuned to an interpretation of Islamic arts according to which the logic of form and color should be radically emancipated from the duty of describing the outside world objectively. In many cases, this conception makes direct allegiance to the example of Islamic works of art. This allegiance distinguishes in particular one of his most programmatic works, the Red Studio of late 1911, maybe early 1912, painted just before he left Paris for Morocco. Right at the center of the composition, he placed, he says, well, let's put it in detail. He says, what he writes, in fact, in a letter to his patron, Russian patron Sergei Shukin from Tangiers in February 1912. So he placed the warm blacks of the border of a piece of Persian embroidery placed above the chest of drawers. You have the quotation in French, the original quotation on the screen. Hoping in this way to encourage his patron to accept, he says, the most musical of all my paintings. This piece of Islamic fabric, most probably in fact a scrap of Ottoman velvet, and certainly not a Persian embroidery, is unrecognizable as such, but is used purely to provide propulsion to the forms, a sort of nucleus of colored energy, closely associated with the artist's paintings and with the flowers in the Persian Qajar vase on the foreground. This simultaneous celebration and obliteration of an Islamic ornamental pattern as harbinger of a modern non-representational decorative aesthetics closely recalls the instrumental use of Islamic lessons by ornament theoreticians and reformers of the previous century, hinting at a new universal language of forms. The inspirational work of art is deprived of its cultural identity in the moment when it exerts its formative action. In parallel, another recurrent feature characterizes Matisse's experimental works of the same period, namely the display of this experimental dimension as such through intentional marks of gestures and chants, stains, overlapping, interruptions, etc., which all contribute to a strong sense of incompletion. Clearly, the tension between exactitude and intentional accidents, carefully designed structure, and undefined patches of medium is what has retained the artist fundamentally. There is a reason for this aesthetics of chance gestures and incompletion. The critical questioning of the image through the image. The painting does not only produce a new kind of expansive ornamental effect, it also provides the eye with a self-critical questioning about the making of images. Such a self-criticism often reveals itself through systematic discrepancies which fracture the overall harmony of the composition with an aggressive juxtaposition of form against form. In the red carpets again, following a diagonal line from the lower right to the top left corner, some zones verge on chaos, while others, on the top, thrive with intense light and color contrasts. Because the motifs are cut by the side of the frame, before dissolving themselves outside the frame in the effectiveness of real life. With reference to the arts of Islam, deconstruction allows the mimetic image to transform itself in a decorative structure. This is what happens from the bottom right to the top left. But it also leaves the question open of how and what for a visual creation has to be made in a modern culture. In the second version of the Sevilla Still Lifes, the powerful two-dimensional expanse of a white and blue Spanish carpet on the right, reinvented by the painter as if it were an Islamic tile work, covers only half of the sofa. The other half, on the left, is painted in perspective, according to the traditional rules that govern the creation of an illusion of depth, something that really that Matisse was exactly wanting to cast away. In short, the paradoxical strength of such an image lies in a sort of critical decoration, self-inquiring, inseparable from a never-ending reflection on the condition of its own existence. Geometrical formalism is immersed in this never-ending critical process, which will pervade Matisse's work up to the monumental paper cutout compositions of his last years, where you have, for instance, pieces of paper carefully cut out with scissors and some other side just torn out, as if by chance. For instance, in the middle with the red patch of paper in the middle of the composition. Let us now go back to our starting point. In Matisse's case, we are confronted with an experimental artistic endeavor which criticizes its own conditions of possibility, culturally through the rejection of imperial Orientalism, and aesthetically through the calling into question of the Western tradition of representation. This criticism is also a self-critical analysis. It includes the artist's work itself in its questioning, even threatening the very possibility of painting in Algeria in 1906, or accepting the menace of an impending chaos through incompletion. Matisse's work is intrinsically modern because it is intrinsically critical. He refuses to build up a definitely decorative work of art, but infuses it with a sense of inquisitive anxiety about its own being. Is this critical stand a way to counterbalance the monstrous overgrowth of fictional images all over the world? Or on the contrary, are critique and crisis once again inseparable? Is the contemporary proliferation of fancy images, including Orientalist ones, hindered or spurred on by the subtle critical anxiety which modern works of art such as Matisse's entrust to their viewers beyond their brilliant and seemingly easy decorativeness? Should we utterly oppose the melancholy self-criticism of kitsch images in the Orientalist vision and the revolutionary inquiries of the avant-garde in applied arts as well as in fine arts about the condition of images? Or are these two trends, each in its own way, nihilistic or utopian, nurturing a rush to the worse in order to obliterate a distressing, maybe unbearable sense of disillusion? This is actually a question I cannot answer. Well, I think that these questions ought to be left open, since we are obviously at a very critical turn of our contemporary societies, their relation to the reality of life. So, well, I'd rather leave you with the question open. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this brilliant analysis. Are there any questions? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for this inspiring lecture. And actually, I have general questions, 2 questions.
Mm-hmm.
You have shown through these examples from the 19th century in a certain way how Islamic art is kind of instrumentalized and how Islamic art is seen through ornaments in a certain way.
Exactly, yeah.
It goes perhaps beyond the chronological frame of your paper, but I would want to know what you think remains of this today in contemporary art, how artists still interpret Islamic ornaments.
Mm-hmm.
And my second question was, how were Matisse's work received in Islamic countries?
Yeah, well, 2 very different questions, in fact. As for the first one, I think, well, I'd rather say something else first, and then maybe I answer your question. I think we are very much stressing a sort of very obvious inspiration taken from the arts of Islam in Orientalist architecture and designs as well, a sort of theater which makes the two sides of Orientalist creations and, I say, Islamophilic, inventions very, very much interlinked. And this is not necessarily the case, and I think that you have many, many, many other examples which are quite difficult to define, to point out, where you can simply not see that an Islamic pattern has been used or was inspirational for the artist. But you can have it in a grid, in an iron grid, along a public garden. You can have it on a bow window, for instance, with glass windows, colored glass windows, and you just don't think that there is something Islamic in it, because it has been completely appropriated and completely digested. So I think that a dream would be for an art historian just to be able to catch all these examples. That would be wonderful, and I think we cannot do that. So we just have to imagine. And very often, when I go through the big cities, European cities of the 19th century, I just fancy, why this wouldn't be coming from the Alhambra motif, and it's just unrecognizable. I think I did not answer your first question, but you can ask it again.
What about Matisse?
No, the second one was about Matisse, but Matisse, the reception of Matisse in if you're talking about the contemporary situation, it is horrible. Because basically Matisse's market, in a way, nowadays is terrible, because most of the works which are available are works of the 20s, when he painted a very big amount of works, was quite disgusted by himself. In the end, he stopped working completely for 2 years, because he said it was enough, and he was just going the wrong way. But still, these paintings are here, and they are sold very, very with very expensive prices, among others to the Middle Eastern world. And this is terrible, because it is completely Orientalist, But the big, influential paintings of the 1910s, they are all in museums now. Almost no one. Sandra knows that much better than me. They are all in Russia or in Western countries, in museums. So we can't talk about a reception of it.
You said at the beginning that Orientalism decomposed Orientalism. So I was wondering, when we saw on the one hand Orientalist paintings, which is really something like a Western view, totally
of Cairo,
imagination, let's say, and we saw the ornament. So shouldn't we say Islamic art or architecture decomposed Orientalism? Because actually Islamic ornament is something where you don't have this imagination, this fantasy, because it's really something totally mathematic.
So,
how would you see, when you look at the ornament and also the quotations, the descriptions of these Islamic ornaments, it's really the mathematical, tectonic, etc., and we have the Orientalist paintings, which are totally different.
Completely, yes. Yeah, this is awkward. That's the reason why I intentionally chose these two images by Hessemer, which are interesting because it was the same artist and he had completely two different interests and two different views completely opposed to each other. I think that at the beginning, in the beginning of the 19th century, in the 1930s, 40s, it was still possible to have these two leanings at the same time, these two sensibilities. And that gradually, when the time passed, the two trends tended to be much more opposed to each other, much more clearly opposed to each other, up to the point that there was a kind of despise, of disgust expressed by these promoters of the scientific side of Islamic aesthetics against Orientalism. It's very obvious with Viollet-le-Duc, but you have many other examples that Ariane knows very well, like Jules Bourgoin in France. In Germany, in France, in England, you find these people who are really, attacking Orientalism on the front. I mean, frontally. So at the beginning, you have a mixture of the two positions in the same person, and then it becomes more and more difficult to have this kind of paradoxical union. Yeah. That's all. Mm. Good.
Well, thank you.
Very good.
I just wanted to say, well, thank you to my colleagues who organized this here in the house. Well, they're not here anymore, but nevertheless, well, it was not me. I haven't done much, I must say. And we will see each other tomorrow at 9 o'clock or 9:15. In the Kunsthaus, another venue in the middle of town. Well, I wish you